Okay, let's dive into this. Picture Los Angeles, June 2025. You've got protests erupting over immigration enforcement, things getting really tense, clashes with police.
And then the big development, the federal government sends in 2,000 National Guard troops.
Exactly. And what the sources really flag is how they were sent. Not by the governor's request, but by presidential order. It's quite a scene.
It really is. And what's striking, looking through this stack of sources, news reports, official statements, accounts from the ground, is just how fast it all escalated.
Right. And that's our mission here for you today. To unpack that escalation based on these sources, we want to lay out the sequence of events, bring in the different voices, protesters, Mayor Bass, Governor Newsom, ICE, the Trump administration.
And really dig into the significance of that federal response, especially using the National Guard in L.A. like that.
Because as you read through this material, you definitely see different stories emerging, right? Conflicting viewpoints on what happened, why, and frankly, a lot of finger-pointing.
Absolutely. Sorting through those narratives is key.
So let's set the scene a bit, based on what the sources tell us. We're in Donald Trump's second term, and immigration policy is very much front and center.
And you have the Los Angeles City Council, back in November 2024, declaring L.A. a sanctuary city.
Which the sources frame as, well, a direct pushback against expected crackdowns from the administration.
Yeah, there was already a lot of anxiety, it seems, among immigrant communities in California about what might be coming.
And it wasn't just talk. The sources mentioned that just the month before, May 2025, the administration had apparently rolled out a new strategy focused on workplace enforcement.
So you've got this backdrop, heightened fear, the sanctuary declaration, and a specific federal strategy targeting workplaces. That context is really crucial for understanding what happened next.
It absolutely is. Which brings us to day one, June 6th. This is the catalyst. The sources say it kicked off around 9:15 a.m. with ICE raids across L.A.
Yeah, they mentioned the specific spots, the Fashion District, a clothing wholesaler, a Home Depot as well.
And initial reports were saying, what, over 100 arrests right off the bat?
That was the initial figure floating around. But later, Homeland Security investigations clarified things. They said 44 people were administratively arrested in those ops.
Okay.
Plus one other person arrested for obstruction. And by the next day, June 7th, DHS put the total number of undocumented immigrants arrested across the area at 118.
And that person arrested for obstruction, that name comes up a lot, David Horta.
Right. Identified in the sources as the California president of the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, reportedly arrested near the Fashion District raid for allegedly blocking an ICE vehicle.
Sources also mention he was injured during the arrest and taken to the Metropolitan Detention Center.
Yeah, and his arrest definitely became a focal point, a rallying cry for the protests that started almost immediately.
And these weren't just peaceful demonstrations from the get-go, according to the reports. They escalated pretty fast into clashes.
We see descriptions of confrontations near that Westlake Home Depot raid site and also near the detention center where Horta was apparently being held.
And force being used.
Yes. Sources mention federal agents using stun grenades, and the LAPD reportedly deployed tear gas, pepper spray, flashbangs. They even authorized less lethal munitions.
And protesters responding.
Also with force, it seems. Reports mention objects, even concrete chunks, being thrown at officers.
Wow. So that first day ended with the LAPD declaring a citywide tactical alert by, 8:24 p.m.?
That's right. It really shows how quickly things spun out across the city.
Okay, so that intense first day leads straight into day two, June 7th, and things didn't calm down.
No, they intensified. The protests spread beyond those initial sites. The sources point to key conflict zones like Paramount and Compton, alongside continued activity in downtown LA.
Let's talk about Paramount. The sources seem to detail that pretty heavily, near a Home Depot again.
Yeah, apparently a known spot for day laborers. Protesters saw DHS officers staging nearby, which seems to have just fueled the existing fear and confusion.
Even though the Paramount mayor, Peggy Lemons, is quoted saying it was just staging, not an actual raid at that location.
Right, but the atmosphere was already charged. The sources describe a scene with maybe 1,000 protesters blocking streets with shopping carts, recycling bins, whatever they could find.
And the response.
Federal agents deploying flashbangs and pepper balls, protesters throwing rocks, other items at ICE vehicles. There's even mention of someone driving aggressively and a car being set on fire.
Jeez. Injuries reported too.
Yeah, among protesters and at least one ICE agent, according to the sources.
And the LA County Sheriff's Department, they were there.
They responded, yeah, But the sources are careful to note their role was apparently traffic and crowd control. They reportedly used tear gas, but weren't involved in the underlying immigration operation itself. That distinction is made clear.
Okay. And elsewhere, in Compton.
Reports mentioned demonstrators throwing glass bottles filled with something that smelled like gasoline. So, another flashpoint.
And downtown, protests continuing near the detention center.
Still going on. Law enforcement formed skirmish lines, gave dispersal orders. An object apparently hit a police cruiser there, too.
The sources also mention some pretty potent symbols being used.
Yeah, reports of American flags being burned, Mexican flags being waved. It really highlights the complex mix of identities and anger involved.
But the biggest development on day 2, the real turning point in the federal response, happens that evening.
That's when President Trump signs the memorandum deploying 2,000 California National Guard members to L.A.
And this is where the legal specifics highlighted in the sources become so important. He invoked Title 10 authority.
10 U.S.C. Section 12406, specifically, to essentially nationalize those guard troops, putting them under federal, not state, control.
Which is unusual.
Extremely. The sources point out it's the first time that specific authority was used to deploy the guard domestically without the governor's consent since 1965 during the Civil Rights Movement.
So bypassing the state governor entirely.
Exactly. Legal experts cited, like Professors Jessica Levinson and Erwin Chemerinsky, they acknowledge the president has powers, like under the Insurrection Act, which is related, but they emphasize this move, cutting out the governor, is different from past L.A. Guard deployments where the state asked for help.
So it sends a strong message.
A very strong message, it seems, about asserting federal authority.
And adding to that federal posture, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth posts on X
that active duty Marines down at Camp Pendleton are on high alert, ready to go if called upon.
Right. So not just the Guard, but potentially Marines, too. A significant show of federal readiness.
Definitely sets a tone.
Which brings us to day 3, June 8th. The Guard starts arriving.
Troops are seen assembling in L.A., mostly outside federal buildings, according to reports.
And the protests.
Yeah.
Still happening.
Sources say they died down a bit overnight, but were definitely still ongoing. Groups like the Party for Socialism and Liberation were calling for more demonstrations, specifically one at City Hall titled, National Guard Go Away ICE Out of L.A.
And meanwhile, the rhetoric is still ramping up. Tom Homan, the administration's border czar,
is quoted by NBC News saying, pretty grimly, that someone's going to lose their life if the protests keep going.
So the immediate impact seems to be ratcheting up the tension between the White House and California even further.
Massively. And President Trump also reportedly weighed in saying masks wouldn't be allowed at protests, another layer of federal direction there.
And as you mentioned earlier, this is where the real finger-pointing kicks into high gear in the source material. Everyone seems to have a different story.
Oh, absolutely. Starkly different takes on who did what and who's to blame.
Let's break down those reactions, starting local. L.A. Mayor Karen Bass.
Her reaction, as reported, was fiercely critical of the initial ICE raids. Quotes like, deeply angered, accusing them of sowing terror and disrupting safety. She called the violence unacceptable.
And she pushed back against federal criticism.
Strongly. Saying she and the LAPD had absolutely no prior warning about the raids.
Yeah.
Her message was clear. We will not stand for this. Governor Newsom, also critical.
Very. He condemned David Huerta's detention and was particularly scathing about Trump federalizing the Guard without his okay. He called it purposefully inflammatory, said it would only escalate tensions.
He basically said local law enforcement didn't need the help.
Explicitly. He said it was the wrong mission for the Guard, would erode public trust, and that local PDs had it handled, though he also called for peaceful protest.
And what about the local police themselves, LAPD, the sheriff's department?
Their statements, according to the sources, focused on clarifying their limited role, emphasizing they don't do civil immigration enforcement, no mass deportation sweeps. Their job was crowd and traffic control.
And LAPD specifically addressed the ICA claim about a delayed response.
Yeah, they countered that, citing issues like federal agents using irritants and the resulting traffic, making it hard for them to respond quickly. So direct pushback there.
Okay, now shifting to the federal side, the Trump administration's response. What's the general tone described? Pretty aggressive. Accusing the left of inciting the protests, demanding Democrats condemn the violence. DHS specifically blamed Bass and Newsom for, quote, contributing to the violence.
And specific statements from key figures, Trump himself.
Praised the Guard deployment, but slammed Newsom and base as incompetent, feckless Democrat leaders, suggesting they couldn't handle things, even comparing it to handling fires or permitting.
Strong words. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem
Issued warnings that protesters involved in violence will be prosecuted.
and FBI Director Kash Patel. There was that exchange with Mayor Bass's statement.
Right. Base said, "We will not stand for this,"
Right.
referring to the raids. Patel reportedly responded simply, "We will," implying the federal government would stand for enforcing its laws and handling the protests.
Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons also features prominently.
Yeah, he's quoted criticizing LAPD directly, claiming that 2-hour response delay we mentioned accused Mayor Bass of siding with chaos and lawlessness
And he tried to justify the ICE actions.
by claiming those arrested included criminal, illegal aliens, mentioning gang members, drug traffickers. Though it's crucial, as you said, the sources themselves note similar claims by Tom Homan were unsubstantiated. So that's a contested point.
Okay. FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino.
Also very forceful. Vowed investigations, prosecutions for anyone throwing objects, quoted saying things like, "More are coming, you bring chaos, and we'll bring handcuffs." A real zero-tolerance message.
And Stephen Miller, known for strong rhetoric.
Extremely strong. Sources cite posts like, "Deport the invaders" or "Surrender to insurrection," and claims the U.S. would cease to exist if these protests weren't stopped.
And Tom Homan, the border czar again?
He's the one who apparently announced the Guard deployment on Fox News, alongside making those unsubstantiated claims about the arrestees.
And the acting U.S. Attorney, Bill Essayli.
Added his voice to the warnings. Stressed that obstructing federal agents is a crime, protesters would face arrest, and he apparently posted about arrests happening on X, reinforcing that federal prosecution threat.
So a very unified, very hardline message coming from the federal side.
Overwhelmingly so, based on these accounts.
And just circling back to the legal side for a second, the Title X deployment?
Right. The sources suggest California Democrats kind of expected something like this, but felt legally constrained in challenging the president's authority to do it.
And one last piece, the international angle.
Yeah, the Mexican consul general in L.A., Carlos Gonzalez Gutierrez, confirmed Mexican nationals were among those arrested and that his office was providing legal help, a reminder of the human and cross-border dimension.
Okay. So let's try to pull this all together. What's the core story emerging from this collection of sources?
It looks like this. Federal ICE raids happen in L.A. They act as a trigger, sparking widespread protests. These protests pretty quickly turn into violent confrontations involving demonstrators, local police, and federal agents.
Then the federal government, under President Trump, makes a really significant move, deploying the National Guard, using that rare authority, bypassing the state governor.
Which just pours fuel on the fire, right?
Yeah.
Ramps up tensions dramatically and leads to this public battle of narratives, federal officials blaming local leaders and protesters, local leaders blaming federal overreach and tactics, lots of conflicting accounts, lots of finger-pointing.
And what really stands out from the sources is just the sheer speed of it all, from raids to clashes to a federal troop deployment decision in, 48 hours?
It's incredibly fast.
Yeah.
And the federal response wasn't just the Guard, it was the talk of Marines on standby, the multiple, very vocal threats of prosecution. It was a forceful assertion of federal power.
And those conflicting accounts, LAPD versus ICE on response times, for example, they really highlight the friction and maybe even the breakdown in coordination between different levels of government during a crisis.
Definitely. Different perspectives, maybe different priorities playing out in real time.
So thinking about all this information drawn straight from these sources, what should you, the listener, take away?
Well, based purely on this material, it raises some big questions. Like, what are the implications when the federal government deploys the military domestically without state consent, especially against protests? What does that signal about federal versus state power?
It also makes you look hard at how terms like lawlessness or insurrection are used versus, say, peaceful protest or civil disobedience. The sources show the same events being framed in completely opposite ways depending on who's talking.
Exactly. And fundamentally, you see this clash between local policies, like LA's sanctuary city status and local police priorities, and determined federal immigration enforcement backed by a White House ready to use significant power.
These sources really open a window onto that specific moment in June 2025 LA, where all those underlying tensions just seem to boil over, triggered by specific actions, and met with a really remarkable federal response.
It is a lot to absorb. Definitely leaves you with some complex issues to think about based on what we've unpacked here.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the events of June 2025 in Los Angeles.